By the third morning, the forest in Oregon no longer felt like terrain we had entered, but like a system we had been temporarily permitted to occupy. The difference subtle, yet unmistakable, as if the trees themselves had recalibrated around our presence and were now observing without urgency the pacing and knocks of the previous nights absent at dawn, replaced instead by a silence that felt heavier. Precisely because it was undisturbed, Ethan moved through camp with controlled efficiency, reviewing thermal anomalies frame by frame, searching for confirmation in pixels, while Lena cataloged the audio files with a discipline that bordered on ritual, labeling each sequence by timestamp and direction. But beneath their methodical focus lingered a shared awareness that data alone would not contextualize what we were experiencing. We needed history, not legend, not speculation about Bigfoot as an abstract idea, but local memory. Someone who had lived through the logging years, someone who had seen the forest before and after the cut. And I knew exactly who that person was because Daniel had mentioned him more than once in his notes. A former ranger who refused relocation when the department consolidated stations. A man named Elias Brooks, who chose to remain in a weathered cabin several miles north of the basin, living within walking distance of the very scar we had documented. Daniel described him not as a believer or skeptic, but as a witness, someone who measured change in bark patterns and bird migration, rather than headlines. And so, by mid-morning, we packed minimal equipment and set out toward the coordinates Daniel had once marked with a small cross beside the word Brooks, the trail leading away from our camp, narrower than the old logging road, more suggestion than path, ferns brushing against our knees as we advanced. And with each step the atmosphere shifted from contested ground to something older and quieter, as though this section of forest had been spared the most aggressive intrusion. The trees here stood thicker, trunks wider, their bark layered in moss so dense it resembled fabric, sunlight filtering through in narrow shafts that illuminated suspended moisture like drifting dust in an abandoned house. And after nearly an hour of walking, the outline of the cabin emerged gradually between trunks. Not abandoned, but not fully maintained either. Its wooden siding darkened by years of rain, roof slightly bowed yet intact, smoke absent from the chimney, but a stack of chopped wood arranged neatly along one wall. Ethan slowed instinctively, lowering his camera as if approaching a sacred site rather than a dwelling. Lena removed her headphones, perhaps sensing that conversation here should not be mediated through circuitry. And I felt a tension unlike the previous nights, not the awareness of being enclosed, but the anticipation of being evaluated by someone human who had chosen to remain where others left. I stepped forward alone and knocked once against the cabin door. The sound, dull, against aged timber. A pause, stretching long enough to question whether Daniel's notes were outdated. Then the faint scrape of a chair inside, followed by measured footsteps. The door opened only halfway, revealing a face carved by time and weather, gray beard untrimmed, eyes sharp despite age. Elias Brooks regarded us without surprise, as though he had been expecting not specifically us, but someone like us, drawn back by unfinished business in the woods. I introduced myself and saw the faintest flicker of recognition at Daniel's name. Not shock, not alarm, but memory settling into place. He studied me a moment longer and then stepped aside, without invitation or refusal, allowing us to enter the cabin's dim interior, where the scent of old paper and wood smoke lingered in layers. Maps covered one wall, hand-annotated with markings that predated digital surveys. Topographic lines intersected by small symbols and notes written in tight script. Ethan's eyes moved immediately to those maps, while Lena remained near the doorway, absorbing the atmosphere. Elias closed the door behind us and spoke in a voice rough but steady, saying that men with cameras usually come chasing stories, but men who come back after 15 years are chasing something else. And the accuracy of that statement silenced any rehearsed explanation I had prepared. I told him about the basin, about the shell casings, about the distributed knocks that encircled our camp, and he listened without interruption, not nodding, not dismissing, simply absorbing. Then he walked to the wall and traced a finger along a section of map corresponding to the circle we had found, tapping once against the paper. Before looking back at me, he said that area was marked closed long before the logging company claimed access. Not officially closed by government decree, but by consensus among those who worked the forest. A place hunters avoided. A place where animals moved differently, where tree breaks appeared at heights inconsistent with storms. He spoke of the logging season 15 years ago, not as a business operation, but as a violation of rhythm, machines entering at dawn and leaving at dusk, the constant whine of saws fracturing the layered silence that had existed for centuries. And he mentioned Daniel without accusation, only stating that my brother had asked questions others avoided, that he walked beyond flagged boundaries to understand what was being cut. And when I asked directly whether he believed something lived within that basin, Elias did not answer with myth or denial. He simply said that the forest holds patterns, and when those patterns are broken, something responds, not out of malice, but out of correction. His gaze steady, unblinking, as if measuring whether I was prepared to hear more than I thought I wanted to know. Elias did not rush his words, and in the quiet interior of the cabin in Oregon, the pauses between his sentences carried as much weight as the statements themselves. He moved toward a small iron stove, though no fire burned inside it, and rested his hand against its cool surface, as if grounding himself in something tangible before continuing. He said that 15 years ago the logging crews were warned, not by officials, but by those who had walked these woods long enough to recognize the signs. There were sections where the animals shifted migration without visible cause, where elk would not cross a certain line even during heavy snow, where birds circled but refused to nest. Daniel had noticed these anomalies too, Elias explained. He had come to the cabin 3 evenings in a row with maps folded under his arm, asking about broken saplings at unnatural heights and tree knocks heard after midnight. At the time, Elias told him what he tells anyone who listens carefully, that the forest is not empty simply because we lack names for what moves within it. Ethan leaned forward at that but did not interrupt, his skepticism tempered now by nights of measured rhythm and triangulated sound. Lena quietly activated her recorder without making it obvious, and Elias continued, describing the night the machines entered the basin, saying the company had pushed past agreed boundaries under pressure to meet quota, ignoring the older survey marks that indicated unstable ground and ecological sensitivity. Daniel had been there, documenting the expansion, arguing with a foreman about the flagged line, and sometime after dusk, the first knock was heard from deeper in the timber, at first dismissed as wood settling or a stray branch, but then repeated 3 impacts spaced with unnerving consistency. Elias said the workers laughed until the 3rd sequence echoed from a different direction, and that was when the laughter stopped. He did not claim to have seen anything clearly that night. Only movement at the edge of floodlights, shapes withdrawing before focus could settle. And then he described something that tightened my chest. He said Daniel came to him the following morning shaken but resolute, stating that he believed the circle at the center of the basin was not debris from storm or accident, but the remains of a constructed shelter, woven over time and violently dismantled by machinery. Daniel had found impressions in mud similar to the ones we recorded, and he had collected audio of the knocks that mirrored Lena's files almost exactly. Ethan exchanged a glance with her at that confirmation, and Elias's voice lowered slightly. As he recounted the final evening before the disappearance, the logging company had returned with heavier equipment, ignoring the previous night's disturbances. Daniel followed them beyond the flagged line again, and shortly after full dark, 2 gunshots cracked through the forest, separated by several seconds, not warning shots into the air, but angled toward something at ground level. Elias heard the echoes roll through timber, and then the machines shut down abruptly. Silence falling heavier than any engine noise, he waited nearly an hour before walking toward the source of the sound. And what he found was not carnage but absence. The equipment left idling without operators, a loader tilted awkwardly as if abandoned mid-maneuver. And near the center of the basin the woven structure flattened, the ground churned. Yet no bodies, no clear trail of blood, only disturbed soil and broken branches radiating outward like a ripple. The workers later claimed panic, claimed confusion, claimed that Daniel had fired at something that rushed from the trees, but their statements contradicted each other in details. Some insisted they saw a bear. Others swore it stood upright longer than any bear could. The company's official report cited wildlife aggression and trespass into unstable terrain. And within weeks, the operation was shut down under legal scrutiny. Unrelated to the disappearance, the basin left to reclaim itself in silence. I asked Elias why he had never publicly contradicted the report, and he looked at me steadily. Before answering that truth without proof becomes spectacle, and spectacle invites more intrusion. He said that if something had survived that night, it would have learned quickly that human curiosity multiplies once fed, and that restraint was sometimes the only protection left to offer a place already violated. Lena's recorder hummed softly between us as she captured every word, and I realized that Elias was not framing the story in terms of monster or myth, but consequence. Pattern disrupted leading to response. Response misinterpreted as threat. Escalation resulting in disappearance. He then walked to a shelf and retrieved a small tin box, opening it carefully to reveal a single spent casing identical to the ones we found in the basin. He placed it on the table between us without flourish, saying Daniel had brought it to him earlier that day, before returning to confront the crew again, stating he hoped not to use the remaining rounds, and the weight of that admission pressed into the room. Because it suggested Daniel did not arrive armed with aggression, but with apprehension, Ethan finally asked the question that had lingered unspoken, whether Elias believed something still occupied that territory now, 15 years later. And Elias did not hesitate this time. He said occupation was the wrong word. that the forest does not belong to what moves within it any more than it belongs to us, but that something there maintains the boundary with intention, and if we had heard 3 knocks, it meant we were close enough to matter. His eyes shifted briefly toward the door as if listening beyond the walls. And in that subtle gesture, I sensed that whatever awareness we felt at camp was not confined to open ground, but extended even here, to the threshold of the cabin itself. Elias stood there for a moment longer with his hand resting on the table beside the single spent casing, and in the dim interior of the cabin in Oregon, the silence that followed his last words felt heavier than any of the knocks we had recorded, because this silence carried memory, not mystery. I asked him why he stayed after that night, why he chose to remain within walking distance of a place most people avoided, even in daylight, and he answered without dramatics, saying that leaving would have felt like surrendering the last witness position, that someone needed to remain who understood the difference between intrusion and presence. He said he had walked the perimeter of the basin many times in the years after the disappearance, never crossing into the center again, only listening, and that the pattern of 3 knocks persisted periodically, not nightly, not predictably, but always in response to something that altered the forest's rhythm, hunters venturing too deep, surveyors placing new markers, hikers straying beyond visible trail. He described it not as hunting behavior but as correction, and the word echoed in my mind with uncomfortable clarity. Because correction implies intent, not chaos. Ethan asked whether Elias had ever seen it clearly, whether he could confirm what we had only captured in fragments of thermal distortion and shadow. And Elias hesitated for the first time, not out of doubt, but out of care in choosing language. He said he had seen enough to abandon disbelief, but not enough to assign certainty. He spoke of a silhouette at dawn once, standing between 2 cedars at a distance that blurred detail yet preserved scale, taller than any man he had known, shoulders broader than logic preferred, still in a way that felt deliberate rather than frozen by fear. He said what unsettled him most was not size, but composure, the absence of frantic movement, even when observed, as if observation itself were anticipated. Lena's recorder captured the faint tremor in his voice as he admitted that the silhouette had turned its head slowly toward him before stepping backward into shadow, without breaking a single branch, and that controlled withdrawal had convinced him more than any footprint. I felt a chill travel through me, not from cold, but from recognition, because that mirrored exactly what we had experienced the previous night at camp. The triangulated knocks, the breath, the retreat, the negotiation of distance rather than a charge. I asked him about Daniel's final hours, about whether he believed my brother had fired in panic or in defense of someone else, and Elias looked down at the casing on the table before answering. He said Daniel was not reckless, that he had argued for caution even with the logging crew, that the second shot likely came after the first failed to create space, and that whatever approached did not behave like a cornered animal. There was no immediate attack on the machines, no scattering of workers, only a focused movement toward the center where the woven structure had stood, as if the confrontation was not with people broadly, but with the act of destruction itself. Ethan shifted uncomfortably at that, perhaps realizing that our cameras and thermal rigs were smaller versions of the same intrusion, and Elias added that after that night, he found no clear human remains, only disturbance and silence. The company pressured local authorities to close the file quickly, citing liability and wildlife unpredictability, and he chose not to contradict them publicly, because doing so would have invited sensationalism, expeditions, armed thrill seekers chasing the legend of Bigfoot, rather than respecting the boundary. He then walked toward the door and opened it slightly, letting in a blade of gray afternoon light, and asked us whether we had crossed into the circle itself. When I admitted that we had stepped inside, documented, measured, and lingered. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, not in anger but in concern. He said the circle was never meant to be catalogued, that it had once been layered over time, woven, maintained perhaps as shelter, perhaps as marker, and that breaking it with machines had altered more than wood. Lena asked quietly whether he believed something had been lost that night beyond Daniel. And Elias answered that loss does not always mean extinction. Sometimes it means displacement, and displacement breeds vigilance. The word vigilance hung in the air like an invisible weight, because it implied that what remained in that forest was not wounded beyond function, but sharpened by memory. Ethan asked whether Elias would come with us to the basin, to stand at the edge and confirm what he knew, and for a moment I thought he would refuse, but instead he closed the door gently and nodded once, saying that perhaps it was time to see how the forest responded to 4 instead of 3. His agreement did not feel like alliance but like acceptance of a turning point. As we stepped back outside the cabin, the air felt cooler, the canopy filtering light into thin, fractured lines across the ground. And I noticed that even here, away from the basin, the birds had gone quiet. Not in panic, but in pause, as if something in the broader pattern had shifted with our decision to return. We gathered minimal equipment, no drones, no floodlights, just cameras and recorders, and as we began walking back toward the scar at the heart of the forest, I sensed that this third approach would not mirror the first 2. Because now we were not merely investigators tracing echoes of the past. We were bringing the last witness back to the boundary. And if vigilance truly governed that territory, then our movement would not go unanswered. The walk back toward the basin felt different with Elias beside us, not because he carried weapons or equipment, but because he carried memory. And memory changes the way space is perceived. The forest in Oregon seemed to register his presence the way it had registered ours days earlier. Subtle shifts in ambient sound, a thinning of birdsong, the faint sense that movement beyond the visible tree line had adjusted in response. Elias did not speak as we moved, his pace steady despite age, boots finding stable ground without hesitation, as if he had walked this route in darkness more than once. Ethan kept the camera low and unobtrusive, resisting the urge to narrate. Lena monitored the audio levels, but avoided raising sensitivity too high, none of us wanting to provoke by amplification alone. And when the outer edge of the basin finally came into view through the trunks, Elias slowed, not from fear, but from recognition, his eyes scanning the fallen timber arranged in that radial pattern we had documented, the broken circle reclaimed by moss, yet still unmistakable in geometry. He stopped just short of the perimeter and exhaled slowly, saying that it had grown back thicker than he expected, that time had softened the violence, but not erased the structure beneath it. Ethan asked quietly whether he would step inside. And Elias shook his head once, saying that he had made that mistake only once in the weeks after Daniel disappeared, and had not crossed the boundary since. His refusal did not feel like superstition, but like respect. For a line drawn without signage, I felt a pull to enter again, to stand where the shell casings lay and measure the distance between past and present. But something in the air pressed against that impulse, a density that had not been present during our earlier visits. Lena's recorder began registering low-frequency tremors almost immediately, faint but consistent. And Ethan whispered that the temperature drop on the thermal display was abrupt along the far tree line, as if a larger mass were interrupting ambient readings beyond the first layer of trunks. Elias raised his hand slightly, signaling stillness without looking at us, and we froze instinctively, the forest holding its breath with us. Then from deeper within, the timber came a single knock, not loud, not aggressive, but clear and resonant, the sound carrying through wood older than any of our recorded histories. Elias closed his eyes briefly at that first strike, not in fear, but in acknowledgement. And when the second knock followed from a slightly shifted angle, he nodded almost imperceptibly, as if confirming a pattern he had heard before. The third knock completed the sequence from behind the basin, rather than within it, enclosing the space in a triangle that did not include us at the center, but placed us at the edge of something defined. Long ago, Ethan's camera captured the geometry of sound, even if it could not capture its source. Lena's waveform spiked with each impact, but no branches snapped, no underbrush thrashed, only the controlled assertion of presence. Elias spoke then, not loudly, not addressing us, but addressing the forest itself, saying that no one here intended to cut or break, that no machines would return, that we were listening, and the words felt less like plea and more like confirmation of terms. The silence that followed stretched thin and precise, and then from beyond the densest cluster of cedars, a shape shifted into partial view. Not stepping fully into open ground, but occupying enough vertical space to redefine scale, shoulders broad, posture upright, motion restrained, the distance too great for detail, yet close enough to eliminate doubt about height. Ethan's breath caught audibly, but he did not zoom in recklessly. Lena's recorder captured a low exhale that vibrated through the clearing like distant thunder, and Elias remained still. Eyes fixed, not challenging, not retreating, the moment balanced on a line thinner than logic prefers. And then, as if some internal threshold had been reached, the figure stepped backward once, weight transferring with measured control, dissolving into overlapping trunks without breaking the rhythm of the forest floor. No rush, no pursuit, only withdrawal consistent with choice. The tension in my chest released slowly, replaced not with relief, but with understanding, because what we had witnessed was not an ambush avoided, but a boundary reaffirmed. Elias lowered his gaze and said quietly that it remembered, not us specifically, but the pattern of intrusion, the sound of engines, the crack of gunfire, and that vigilance does not fade simply because time passes. Ethan finally exhaled and whispered that we had our proof. But the word proof felt insufficient, almost disrespectful, because what stood beyond those trees was not a specimen or a headline, but a participant in a history we had only begun to grasp. Lena removed her headphones slowly, eyes still on the tree line, and I realized that the question driving me back to this forest had shifted subtly yet profoundly. I had come seeking confirmation of what happened to Daniel, hoping to frame his disappearance within myth or accident, but standing at the edge of that basin with Elias beside me, and the memory of 3 deliberate knocks echoing through timber, I understood that his story was intertwined with something larger than a single night, something that did not attack blindly, but responded when patterns were broken. And as we stepped carefully away from the perimeter without crossing into the circle, leaving it intact this time, I felt the forest resume its layered sound gradually, birds returning in cautious increments, wind redistributing scent through needles and moss, the system recalibrating once more. And in that recalibration lay the quiet conclusion of this chapter. Not resolution, but recognition. Because whatever moved within these woods under the legend of Bigfoot had shown restraint where violence might have been easier, and that restraint implied intelligence sharpened by memory. As we turned back toward the path leading to the cabin, and eventually to our camp, Elias walking slightly ahead, I knew that the line had not been erased, only clarified, and that the next step we chose would determine whether this remained a negotiation of space or became the repetition of a mistake made 15 years earlier.